Welcome to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast, empowering and inspiring your journey to optimal health. Hosted by Dr. Supatra Tovar, clinical psychologist, registered dietitian, fitness expert, and author of Deprogrammed Diet Culture. Rethink your relationship with food, heal your mind, and live a diet-free life. And Chantal Donnelly, physical therapist and author of Settled, How to Find Calm in a Stress-Inducing World. We follow our guests' journey to optimal health, providing you with the keys to unlock your own wellness path. Tune in and evolve with us. Hello and welcome to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. I am Dr. Supatra Tovar.
And I am Chantal Donnelly.
We are very excited to have a registered dietitian nutritionist, Dr. David Wiss, with us today. Welcome, Dr. Wiss.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait to build some energy with the both of you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to read a little bit about Dr. Wiss, and then we'll get right into our questions. Dr. David Wiss became a registered dietitian nutritionist, or an RDN, in 2013 and founded Nutrition in Recovery, a group practice of RDNs specializing in treating eating and substance use disorders. He earned his PhD in public health with a minor in health psychology from UCLA. Dr. Wiss is a scientific author with over 20 peer-reviewed publications, a nutrition and health consultant, functional medicine practitioner, recovery coach, and passionate educator. Learn more about the intersection of nutrition and mental health at Wise Mind Nutrition, where you can explore his revolutionary mobile app available for download today. Welcome, Dr. Wiss.
Thank you so much.
Wow. What an impressive bio. You have been through quite the journey, mostly in the nutritional world. Got your master's at the University of Northridge and also did an internship at UCLA Medical Center. What sparked your passion to get into nutrition?
Thank you. And I think you chose the right word with journey. It has been a long, nonlinear, exploratory ride. And being a dietitian was not my goal growing up. I think I had other aspirations. And I ran into some health challenges in the early 20s. And it's so typical. People that are nutritionists had their own little journey. They got into health. They found out how transformative it is and want to tell the whole world about it, right? So I have that a little bit. It's true. Early 20s, trying to figure out my life, struggling with some mental health stuff, some addiction stuff, and took a pretty hard pivot in 2006 and got into fitness and nutrition and sunlight and sleep and taking supplements. And, you know, within a few months, everyone was like, I have no idea who you are. I just know that I want your help. Can you help me? And I was like, sure. And I started helping people out of passion, you know, and I immediately started working as a trainer and was hanging out with people that were in recovery, helping people. I remember the early days being like, yo, let's go to Whole Foods. I'll walk aisle to aisle with you and show you some things, you know, and I just wanted to share. So it's almost as if the profession chose me. I thought about how am I going to pursue this path? I've always been passionate about nutrition, but of course, passionate about helping people, one-on-one work, recovery. And so, I explored the possible ways to which I could pursue this avenue, and registered dietitian nutritionist sort of popped up as a path. I started pursuing that. I had to go back and kind of switch gears and go back to a community college and take organic chemistry and biochemistry. And I just started doing what was needed to, pursue that path. And of course, you know, once I got there, there was a lot more to think about. And I always knew that I wanted to do more, but I built Nutrition in Recovery immediately after finishing my master's and dietetic internship, because I knew that I wanted to really promote the role of nutrition and the role of the registered dietitian nutritionist in mental health settings. And I've been doing just that for 11 years, and it's going great.
I love it. I love that you know, were inspired by your own journey. I think that that's, like many of us, and I think you and I have a similar, educational path. You got your master's, then you got your PhD, and I got my master's and got my PsyD. So I know that it's a very long road and you have to be so passionate about it. I'm curious about your focus on eating and substance use disorders, especially with nutrition and recovery. Can you tell us what, inspired you to choose those two specific disorders, and how do you treat that in your group practice?
Yeah. So, I did go through a treatment center, and that really, really helped me start over my life. And of course, there wasn't a point of view about nutrition there. It was sort of like comfort food, convenience food. I was at a place where there was vegetables and whatnot. There was like support, but it wasn't supportive per se. And I definitely was aware that there was abnormal eating behavior. That was like super obvious from my own experience. I'm talking about night eating, binge eating, people that are, trying to build muscle, body image issues. And I saw that there was a very interesting complex intersection between eating and substance use disorders that was a little bit different than the traditional eating disorder paradigm, right? The, mainstream eating disorder model is like very restriction focused and very much has certain patterns of clusters of other mental health diagnoses. And, the message that I started to cook up, from helping people was, a little bit different than the traditional eating disorder message. And I wanted to bridge the gap between these two fields because I saw that they weren't really cooperating with each other. And there was very different points of view about things like sugar and sugar addiction. And there seemed to be this huge split where people were looking at the other people like they were crazy, they had lost their mind, and there was just this unresolved energy. And I found myself sort of in the middle of it because I'm doing classic eating disorder work, but I'm also teaching nutrition at substance use disorder facilities. And there wasn't a clear message. Like there wasn't a manualized textbook message that was going to work. And so I thought maybe I could help develop some of my own messaging. And that's really what birthed nutrition and recovery and some of the research and publications that I've done to really look at things like addiction like eating, hedonic eating, nutrition and recovery from stimulants, the body image issues, all of that stuff. And it's a really interesting area, and there isn't a lot of empirical research. And I really thought that I would, kind of be involved in an avalanche of studies. And, I've done a few and it's slowed down. There still isn't really good data on, nutrition interventions for addiction recovery. And there isn't really good data on co-occurring eating and substance use disorder. And I think it's because those two fields haven't been very cooperative. And so I have a vision for integration and more collaborative work. And I'm part of a few organizations that are trying to make some of this happen. But I think, as you probably know, change is slow, change is hard. Sometimes it takes a full generation. Sometimes you have to wait for the old gatekeepers to move on before we can step in. And there's a lot of work we need to do. And I just feel so grateful to be a part of it.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I would assume with the substance use and eating disorder connection that the dopamine pathway might have something to do with that. If you could just briefly explain that in the simplest terms for our listeners, because I think I do get a lot of people who have, what they proclaim as food addiction. And I do see it very similar to substance use disorders. Give
Mm.
our listeners a little picture of what that looks like.
Yeah, usually there's some sort of a background in early life adversity or trauma or PTSD or some other really clear risk factor, right? Attachment issues, relational ruptures. There's some clear risk factor to prime someone for addiction-like behaviors, right? So sometimes the food comes first and people find ultra processed foods or highly palatable foods, we sometimes call it, at a really young age, and start overactivating the dopamine system as a way of reducing negative affect, right? It's a very predictable, very clear path to making negative emotionality go away in the short term. And so it's not surprising that people become emotional eaters or hedonic eaters, comfort eaters. There's so many different terms, but the one that you used is one that I use, and I use it lightly because I know that there's a lot of controversy around it, but it's called ultra processed food addiction, and it's real, right? And
Mhm.
so, yeah, many people find that first and then maybe have body image issues related to it, find other substances later on in the teenage years, and it becomes this sort of whack-a-mole, as some people call it, where you're able to use substances, alcohol, stimulants, and the food noise goes away. And then when someone gets sober and they're in treatment, the food noise comes back, and that's when all the eating behaviors reemerge. So you could use the term cross addiction. I think the phrase self-medication works really well, but essentially what happens when someone overexposes themselves to a rewarding substance is that it becomes more salient and the person will assign it more value as something that is survival promoting to help make life feel more manageable. And we do see the opposite, where people don't really have any food issues until they get sober. So it wasn't like there was a lot of early life sneaky eating and all of that. There was alcoholism turned into addiction. And then when the person got sober, the brain is freaking out. And they said, where's the regular daily dose of dopamine? And it's like, here it is. Caffeine, nicotine, sugar, ultra processed foods. And that can create new problems. And I think in early recovery, there's some room for some of that, right? Like,
Mhm.
let's be realistic. The brain needs a certain amount of stimulation, right? But the question that I always pose was like, okay, what about after 6 months of sobriety? What happens after a year?
Mhm.
At what point do we reevaluate some of those things? So yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of it does have to do with neurochemistry, just basic dopaminergic needs, and they at least seem like needs because that's the way the brain works. But we really know that they're more like wants that can be managed through really good counseling and other interventions.
Yeah, it's so amazing to me. When I think of addiction, whether it is alcohol, food, any kind of addiction, I think of them as coping strategies. And as you had mentioned earlier, there's trauma, there's ongoing stress, right? So, what tools do you have to cope? And if you take away the food tool, is there another healthy tool that we've replaced it with, or are you going to go to the alcohol and or vice versa, as you were mentioning? So to me, it's really about the fact that we haven't given people the proper coping strategies and tools and techniques. And it sounds like you are replacing the food with those healthier options to calm the nervous system and to deal with the past trauma and the past history people are carrying around with them. And so my next question actually leads right into that, because I know at UCLA, you got your PhD and you were researching adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. And correct me if I'm wrong, ACEs were originally discovered from scientists who were looking at obesity. I'm just curious, maybe you can explain to our audience what ACEs are first.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and then maybe what you have found and how you work with them and how that's informed your practice.
Yeah, thank you for the background piece. I think it's important, and not a lot of people know that the principal investigator of the adverse childhood experience studies, Dr. Folletti, prior to implementing this instrument in the Kaiser system, uh, noticed that they were involved in a weight management program and that people who were having the worst outcomes, dropping out of treatment, gaining weight back more readily, happened to have a higher level of childhood trauma, right? And I think that was the piece that really kind of gave birth to, wow, maybe there's more to ACEs than just social factors, ascribed meaning. But I did actually do some pretty deep dives there. And I learned that it gave birth to this sort of idea that people were regaining the weight as what they called a protective measure, as a way to prevent future re-victimization. And I think this emerged from psychodynamic theories in the 80s and 90s that people were intentionally gaining weight back with a history of CSA, because, right, they didn't want to feel vulnerable. And I do think that that theory has some really good merit. And at the time, it seemed like the best that they could do. And I believe it to be true. But in the last 10 years, 15 years, we've really started to understand how adversity, different forms of abuse can actually become biologically embedded, how it can affect the nervous system and the immune system and actually change the brain, change the reward pathways. And so when I did an initial dive on the background of this sort of ACE BMI link, it seemed to be lacking an understanding of the biological mechanisms, right, of trauma and how that can prime someone for addictions and addiction like eating. One of the huge findings from the original ACE research from Kaiser San Diego was, that people that had 4 or more ACEs were like 5 to 10 times more likely, and had a higher that odds ratios to use illicit drugs, to inject drugs, etc. And so based on this psychodynamic theory that I think I heard a lot of my clients and patients say, I remember asking one of them, I was like, do you believe that that's true? And they were like, no, I don't. My therapist told me. And so I've internalized it for many, many years. And I'm sure it's true. I believe it to be a good theory. I'm just saying it's incomplete, and it became mainstream. And I started to think, well, if ACEs are such a strong predictor of illicit drug use, and there's biology there, why wouldn't we be able to transfer that model using a food addiction model and start to look at how ACEs predict hedonic eating, loss of control eating? And the mechanisms from substance use disorder and addiction like eating are the same, right? It's the mesolimbic dopaminergic projection. Yeah. It's the same pathway, right?
Amen.
Right. It's like a crystal clear story. Yeah. And, I did a systematic review meta-analysis on ACEs and BMI. And, one of the things we did in the systematic review process was just see what the authors kind of used to explain why ACEs. Why do people think ACEs lead to an increase in BMI over the lifespan? And, of course, we were trying to figure out what, perspectives people were adding to the field. And of course, there's a lot of, obvious, this is a perfect example of, if you want to study something, you have to look at the biology, the mechanisms, you have to look at all the psychological factors, and then of course the social determinants of health. People that have a lot of ACEs also tend to live in lower income neighborhoods and have, right, less access to groceries and unsafe parks. Like, there's so many different ways that one could approach this type of thinking. And, I'm very fortunate to have training that allows me to think in all of the different ways. But I did take particular interest in the biology. How does trauma change the human body to make someone more susceptible to impulsivity, loss of control, and self-medication through substance use? And, we have a lot of mechanisms, and I don't know how deep you guys want to go into that, but, we got the nervous system, the HPA axis, the immune system, we've got gut microbiota, we've got
amygdala,
changes in structural, functional, morphological changes in the brain, executive functioning. It's rich. It's a deep, deep area of study, how trauma affects biology and how biology affects behavior, and then how behavior creates a feedback loop. And it's fascinating, and it's really, ripe for investigators to do some really good work.
Well, speaking of really good work, and I support your research there and can attest to seeing the effects of trauma on my clients, especially the ones who suffer from eating disorder, disordered eating, substance use. Yes, yes, amen to all of that. You also have a wealth of research that you have conducted since you started school. Can you give us some, just highlights, something that will, pepper the audience to want to go and look into your research? What are some of the highlights of your research?
Yeah, thanks. I think that it's worth mentioning that when I was in school at UCLA and studying community health sciences, there wasn't faculty there that was privy to nutrition or nutrition for mental health. So I had to do a lot of that on my own with, people from other universities. I have my own little team of collaborators, and a lot of that was like outside of my PhD. It was more like what I did clinically and my passion project. So I was doing ACE research as part of my dissertation, and there was several studies linking depression, anxiety, and other mental health outcomes. But the work, my passion work, has really been on conceptualizing cases where people have food addiction and an eating disorder, and trying to understand, using temporal sequencing and using a history of ACEs and adversity, on how best to intervene from a therapeutic and nutritional point of view. So there was a study called the DFANG, which was like the early days, 2016, I believe it was, the Disordered Eating, Food Addiction, Nutrition Guide, which helped people understand that there was a continuum, a spectrum, that it wasn't just like it's either this diagnosis or this, that people fall in these gray areas, and we have to think in these non-binary ways if we want to treat our patients. Too many people learned like, this is how we do it over here, this is the approach, or this is the food philosophy. And I've always been the guy that says, throw all the food philosophies out the window and try to think about the person that's right in front of you and do a really good timeline. Figure out their life history. And so the DFANG was the first paper to think about how one might think about nutrition interventions when there are substance use disorders, eating disorders, and other addictions. And then, it was missing the trauma link. And so there's an actual case study in there. And then, a couple years later, we added to that, in the paper is called Separating the Signal from the Noise, How Psychiatric Diagnoses Can Help Discern food addiction from dietary restraint. The major criticism of food addiction in the eating disorder world is that it doesn't adjust for people's dieting behaviors. It doesn't control for someone being underweight or being very restrictive or having a lot of rules. So we built a 8-step process to help people figure out if it's more likely to be addiction or if it's more likely to be restriction, and what to do about it. Right. Mm-hmm. And that was a really meaningful contribution. And, I've since been building on that work. We've done some intervention work using lower carbohydrate approaches with social support group therapy for treating addiction like eating. And more recently, during the pandemic, I collected data in my own private practice. So I got out an IRB and just started doing my own research from my own clinical practice, which is, something I'm very proud of, to be able to do the entire process from the collection to the statistics to the writing. And I have a few papers that are in review, 1 or 2 that just got published, and more coming. But it really is along the similar lines of thinking about ACEs and ultra processed food consumption, eating disorders, food addiction, and which one is coming first? What's the stronger signal? So I've done some structural equation modeling, which is basically mediation analysis using all the variables together. And I'm really excited to share that with the world. Should be coming real soon.
You're
Wonderful.
fancy. You're fancy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of late nights at the computer being very unwell, if you want to know the truth.
Geeky and fancy, and a little dedicated and persistent, right?
That's all the good side of it. My wife knows the dark side.
The wife always knows the dark side.
Definitely. Well, we're a little bit short on time for this half of this podcast. We haven't even gotten to all of our questions for this half, but we
This
do
was
need to
juicy enough, I think, though.
Oh, you've got a wealth of information, and I certainly can relate to your approach. I do think it has to be an individualized approach. You can't just apply a model and have everybody fit into that. And you certainly can't just stick anybody into these diagnoses. I always find that there is a continuum, a gradient, and we should be aware of that. That's why I don't diagnose unless I absolutely have to, because I feel like that just pigeonholes somebody into a category that they may not completely fit into. So I do appreciate all of your research. We are going to take a break, and then we'll be coming back next week for the second half of this amazing interview with Dr. David Wiss, and we will return next time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight podcast. Please remember, the content shared on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. You can find us anywhere podcasts are streaming, on YouTube at my.anew.insight and at anew-insight.com under the ANEW Body Insight podcast tab. Follow us on our socials at my.anew.insight on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads for more updates. Tune in next time and evolve with us.